I waited by the village gate, my heart heavy with worry. The sun had long set, and the night air was cold. My son, Ọjàdike, had been gone for days, and no one knew if he would come back alive. The evil forest had claimed many lives before him. Yet, Ọjàdike had gone in, with nothing but his courage, to find the Ofo and save our village. I watched as Ọjàdike walked into the evil forest. His back was straight, but I could see his shoulders trembling. He was afraid, and so was I. No one who entered that forest had ever returned. Yet, my son went in because of the Ofo, the sacred staff that had been stolen. Without it, our village, Ebenebe, was lost. Ọjàdike, please be careful, I whispered, though I knew he could not hear me. My heart pounded in my chest, tears filling my eyes. He was only a young man, just 28 years old, but now he was our only hope. The forest was thick with darkness, the trees seemed to breathe, and strange sounds echoed from within. Wild beasts lived there, creatures that fed on fear. I knew they would come for my son. But Ọjàdike kept walking, disappearing into the shadows. I felt a deep ache in my heart. Would I ever see him again? Ọjàdike stood at the edge of the evil forest, his heart pounding in his chest. The night was heavy, and the trees loomed like dark shadows reaching for him. He knew he had no choice but to enter. Deep inside, the Ofo, the sacred staff of our people, was lost. Without it, Ebenebe would never know peace again. I watched him from afar, holding my breath. The beasts inside that forest were real, and no one who had gone in before had returned. But my son, my Ọjàdike, would face them. He had to. It was hard to believe that this was the same child I had brought into the world with trembling hands. He had always been quiet, and many thought him weak. Yet here he was taking on a task that even the strongest men of our village feared. But as I stood there, watching his figure disappear into the dark, I couldn't shake the fear in my heart. How could a young man, barely grown, defeat the horrors that lurked inside? My name is Adogo, and I am Ọjàdike's mother. This is not the story of a boy who became a hero in the way you might expect. No, this is the story of my son, how he entered that forest, faced the unimaginable, and returned with the Ofo in his hands, only to find that glory had slipped from his grasp. From the day of his birth, his path had been filled with struggle, but I never imagined it would lead him to this. The day Ọjàdike was born, the wind howled, and the sky turned dark. The midwives whispered that it was a bad sign. My labor was long, and I was scared. I prayed to the Chukwu Abiyama to keep my child safe. When Ọjàdike was finally born, he did not cry. I feared he was not alive. Then, after a long moment, he let out a soft wail. He will be strong, one of the midwives said, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. He was a small baby, quiet and calm. Many in the village thought he would not survive. But Ọjàdike did survive, though he remained quiet. As a boy, Ọjàdike had always been different. While other children ran through the village, full of laughter and energy, he would sit quietly by the river, staring at the water as if listening to some distant voice. He was a thinker, with the spirit of a warrior. Many people in Ebenebe said he would never amount to much. But I saw something in him that others could not. He had a quiet strength, a determination that ran deep. And now, as I stood at the edge of that cursed forest, I could only pray that his strength would be enough to bring him back. The day the Ofo went missing was the beginning of everything. I remember it like it was yesterday. The village was alive with the sound of drums, people moving about, carrying out their daily chores. No one suspected that our greatest protection, the Ofo, was about to be taken. The Ofo was the heart of Ebenebe. It was not just a staff, it held the power of our ancestors, protecting us from evil and ensuring our crops grew strong. Without it, we were vulnerable. The elders warned us time and time again to guard it carefully, but no one believed anyone could steal such a sacred object. Then, one morning, we woke to silence. The village square, where the Ofo was kept, was empty. The obu doors were wide open, and the Ofo was gone. Panic spread quickly. The elders gathered in haste, their faces pale with fear. The village people whispered in disbelief. Who would dare to steal the offal? We all knew what it meant if it wasn't found. Without the offal, our village would fall into chaos. The crops would wither, sickness would spread, and the beasts from the evil forest would have access to our land. Ọjàdike, my son, watched quietly from the edge of the crowds. I could see the worry in his eyes, though he didn't speak it. He had always felt the weight of the village's troubles, even when they weren't his to bear. He understood the importance of the offal more than most, though he never said why. The elders quickly decided that someone must go into the evil forest to find it. They believed the offal had been taken there, to the place no one dared enter. The forest was a place of dark magic, full of beasts and spirits that fed on fear. No one who entered ever returned. But we had no choice. Without the offal, our village was doomed. Days passed and no one stepped forward. Fear gripped the people. No one was brave enough to face the evil that lurked in the forest. Even the strongest warriors refused. That's when Ọjàdike came to me. Mother, he said quietly, his voice steady, I will go. Quote. My heart stopped. I looked at him, my son, still young, his face calm but his eyes full of determination. I shook my head, fear rising in my chest. No, Ọjàdike. You can't. It's too dangerous. Quote. But he didn't listen. He never argued, never raised his voice, but once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. I have to, mother. No one else will. Quote. The day Ọjàdike left for the evil forest remains the hardest day of my life. As Ọjàdike stepped deeper into the forest, he felt the weight of the darkness pressing against him. The air was thick, and every sound made his heart race. He had never been so afraid, but he could not turn back. The offal had to be found. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes. Ọjàdike froze. A pair of glowing eyes stared at him from the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. He gripped a small knife he had brought with him, though he knew it would be useless against whatever was watching him. The creature stepped forward. It was huge, covered in fur, with sharp teeth and claws. It growled low, its eyes fixed on Ọjàdike. For a moment, Ọjàdike considered running. But he knew he couldn't. The village was depending on him. He had to be brave. He had to fight. Ọjàdike faces more dangers in the forest, his journey filled with battles, fear, and courage. Ọjàdike was deep in the heart of the evil forest, his feet sinking into the damp earth with every step. The air was thick with mist, and the trees twisted and bent in strange shapes. The only sound was his own breathing and the distant growls of the beasts that haunted him. He clutched the knife in his hand, but he knew it wouldn't be enough if the creatures found him. His mind raced with thoughts of the offal, the sacred staff that had been stolen from the village. Without it, Ebenebe was doomed. The elders had told him the forest was alive, that it would try to confuse him, to lead him astray. He had to stay focused. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the rough bark of a tree. In the distance, he saw a faint glow, a light that didn't belong in this cursed place. His heart quickened. Could it be the offal? Cautiously, he moved toward the light, careful not to make a sound. As he drew closer, the mist cleared, and there, half buried in the ground, was the offal. It shone with a soft golden glow, its power unmistakable even in the darkness. But before Ọjàdike could take a step, he heard a growl. He froze. From behind the trees, a beast appeared. It was massive, its body covered in scales, its eyes burning red with anger. It moved slowly, circling the offal, as if guarding it. Ọjàdike knew he had to act fast. The beast hadn't seen him yet, but it wouldn't be long before it caught his scent. He looked at the offal, it was just within reach, but getting it would mean facing the beast head on. There was no time to think. He had to be brave. With a deep breath, Ọjàdike crept closer. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle in his body tense. The beast's growls grew louder, its head turning as if sensing something was wrong. Ọjàdike's hand trembled, but he reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the offal. At that moment, the beast roared, its massive body lunging toward him. Ọjàdike grabbed the offal and rolled out of the way just in time. The beast's claws slammed into the ground where he had stood moments before. With the offal in his hand, Ọjàdike felt a surge of power. The staff was warm, almost alive, and as he gripped it tighter, he felt its energy flow through him. The beast growled again, its eyes locked on him. But this time, Ọjàdike didn't feel fear. He stood tall, the offal glowing in his hand. The beast roared, charging at him, but with a swift motion, Ọjàdike raised the staff. A bright light shot from the offal, hitting the beast square in the chest. The creature let out a terrible cry before collapsing to the ground. Ọjàdike stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing. The beast was defeated, but the journey wasn't over. He had the offal, but now he had to make it out of the forest alive. He looked around, the trees still looming above him, the darkness still pressing in. But with the offal in his hand, he felt stronger, braver. He knew he could make it back to the village. He had to. With one last glance at the fallen beast, Ọjàdike turned and began the long journey home, with the offal glowing softly in his hand. Ọjàdike stumbled through the thick bushes, sweat dripping down his face, his heart racing. The evil forest was darker than night, and every step he took felt like it dragged him deeper into its grip. He could hear them, the beasts, closing in on him, their low growls vibrating through the air. He held the offal tightly in his hand, the sacred staff he had risked everything to find. But now, it wasn't just about the offal. It was about surviving. Suddenly, there was a loud rustle behind him. Ọjàdike turned, eyes wide with fear. From the shadows emerged a beast unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its eyes glowed like burning coals. It towered over him, its claws sharp enough to tear him apart. Ọjàdike's heart pounded, but he didn't run. He couldn't. He had come too far to give up now. He tightened his grip on the knife he had brought with him, a small weapon against such a monster, but it was all he had. The beast lunged at him with a roar, and Ọjàdike jumped to the side just in time. His foot slipped on the wet ground, and he fell hard, the breath knocked out of him. The beast didn't waste a second. It came at him again, faster this time, its teeth bared. Ọjàdike rolled out of the way, just as the beast's claws struck the ground where he had been. He pushed himself up, panting, his body aching. He had to think fast. Then he remembered how he defeated the previous beast with power from the offal in his hand. With a deep breath, Ọjàdike steadied himself. The beast growled and charged again. This time, Ọjàdike didn't run. He stood his ground, holding the offal in front of him. As the beast came closer, something inside him stirred. He felt the power of the offal pulse through his hand. In a moment of instinct, Ọjàdike thrust the offal forward. Light exploded from the staff, bright and fierce, blinding the beast. It howled in pain and backed away, stumbling into the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. The beast was gone, but Ọjàdike knew it wasn't over. There were more of them out there, waiting. He couldn't stay here. He had to get back home. His body was weak, every muscle burning, but he forced himself to move. The path out of the forest was long, and the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, but Ọjàdike didn't stop. He couldn't. The village needed the offal, and he had made a promise to bring it back. The beasts followed him, their growls echoing through the trees, but Ọjàdike kept moving. Every step was a fight, every breath heavy with exhaustion. But he kept going. The faces of the people in Ebenebe filled his mind, his mother, the elders, the children. They were all counting on him. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw it, the edge of the forest. The lights of the village fires flickered in the distance. He had made it. Ọjàdike stumbled forward, his legs barely able to carry him. But as he stepped out of the forest and into the open, he realized something. There was no one waiting for him. No cheers, no cries of joy. The village was silent. He walked slowly, his clothes torn, his face tired. In his hand, he held the UFO, its soft glow lighting his path. I ran to him, tears filling my eyes, but when I got closer, I saw the pain in his face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand, relief, but also sadness. Ọjàdike, I cried, reaching for him, but he stepped back, holding the UFO out in front of him as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. I did it, mother, he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely louder than a breath. I found the UFO. Quote. I pulled him into my arms, feeling his body tremble. He had done what no one else could do. My son had gone into that cursed forest, faced the beasts, and returned with the UFO. He had saved us all. But when we walked into the village, there was no cheering, no celebration. The elders came forward, taking the UFO from Ọjàdike's hands. They nodded, saying a few words of thanks, but then they turned away, as if nothing special had happened. The villagers went back to their huts and the night grew quiet again. I looked at my son, expecting him to feel proud, but his shoulders slumped. The weight of the journey and the battles he fought in that forest clung to him, but no one seemed to see it. He had brought back the UFO, saved the village, and yet there was no glory for him. No one truly understood the danger he faced or the fear he had to conquer. As we walked home, I could see the hurt in his eyes, though he said nothing. Ọjàdike had done something great, but it seemed no one cared. He was still the quiet boy, the one people overlooked, even though he had just performed a miracle. That night, as he lay in his bed, I sat beside him, holding his hand. You are a hero, Ọjàdike, I whispered. But he only nodded, staring up at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. In that moment, I realized something. Being a hero didn't always mean receiving praise or being celebrated. Sometimes, it meant doing what was right, even if no one noticed. My son had done just that, and though the village might not give him the glory he deserved, in my heart, Ọjàdike would always be a hero. This is not just the story of a hero but of a young man who fought, not for glory, but for the love of his people.